Hello, I'm David Hughes. Welcome to Your Perfect Body, the podcast of the esoteric teaching community. Today's selection is an essay entitled Oneness Means Nothingness. The concept of oneness, used so glibly in various so-called spiritual teachings, is another ontological malapropism. Oneness means identity, an abstract function of Aristotelian logic that is often misapplied. Tabby is a cat, and Fluffy is also a cat. Does that make them one? Are they identical? Of course not. So just because one entity and another share a particular quality, does that mean they are one? Only in some misguided people's imaginations. Identity is only possible between abstractions, such as classes. It is a bit of mathematical or logical sleight of hand. The identity of Tabby and Fluffy is only on the level of category. They are both cats. As individuals, they are not and can never become one. Just because you are conscious and I am conscious, do we lose our individualities and merge into one person? No. And just because I am a spiritual being and God is a spiritual being, that does not mean that he and I will ever merge into one. The misconception that God is an ocean of consciousness and the individual living entity is a drop that can merge back into that ocean is a cruel myth. It gives us a false conception of God as impersonal, a false image of spiritual existence, and a false goal that keep us from striving for the real goals of wisdom, spiritual advancement, and love of Godhead. God cannot be impersonal, because we are created by God and we are individual persons. To think otherwise is an indication that we are ignorant of the true nature of consciousness. Consciousness is eternally personal, subjective, and individual. So even accepting that God is the reservoir of all consciousness, that is all the more reason that why we can never become one with him. Oneness or identity can only be qualitative, never quantitative or substantive. Every entity is distinct and individual from all others. Even mass-produced items like machine parts are subtly different. This is very easy to prove, but there is no evidence that proves the oneness of any two entities. The world simply does not work that way. Even on a spiritual level, duality, not oneness, is fundamental. As we discussed before in the essay on content and context, consciousness requires the foreground-background, content-context distinction. Actually, even dualism is not enough to support consciousness. It needs a trinity. The subject is the conscious, subjective self. The object is the contents of consciousness, and the relationship between them provides the meaning of the experience. You cannot reduce reality any further than this trinity of subject-object relationship. Remove any one of them, and there cannot be consciousness. Take away the subject, the conscious entity, and there is no one to be conscious. Take away the object, and there is nothing to be conscious of. Take away the relationship between the subject and object, and again, there is no consciousness. In the absence of consciousness, as we have pointed out before, there is nothing. All three, subject, object, and relationship, are required for consciousness to exist. So not only oneness is nothingness, so is duality. This trinity of subject, object, and relationship is the fundamental minimum requirement for existence, consciousness, and everything else. At the very highest level, the esoteric teaching tells us there are the Supreme Personality of Godhead, His innumerable potencies or energies, and their relationship. He is the predominator, and they are predominated. This triple ontological aspect permeates all of existence. Therefore, He is known in the esoteric teaching as Trinath, or the Lord of Threes. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, His potencies, and their relationships are all spiritual, but they are all one only qualitatively. If they ever became one in all respects, the entire creation would collapse. We know consciousness and individuality are eternal from Bhagavad Gita 2:12. Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be. So Krishna and ourselves have been existing eternally, and we will continue to exist eternally. The fact that we are conscious means that we are spiritual and eternal. Eternal life is already ours. It is ours by our very nature. If there were any possibility that we could merge with God at any time in the future, Krishna would not state that both He and we are eternal. Eternal means without beginning or end. Therefore, duality, or actually Trinity, is fundamental to existence. We have existed as individuals in the past, we continue to exist as individuals in the present, and we shall continue to exist as individuals in the future. We shall never merge with any other being, because the very nature of consciousness is triune. So, do you still want to become one with God? To become one with God is known as Sayuja Mukti in the esoteric teaching. One's consciousness and individuality become merged with the supreme consciousness and individuality of Brahman. So what happens when one attains Sayuja Mukti? Well, one loses consciousness, first of all, permanently loses consciousness, and one also loses one's individuality, one's self. So there's no more consciousness, there's no more self. Practically speaking, one ceases to exist. So this Sayuja Mukti is not very desirable, and the followers of the esoteric teaching consider it to be worse than going to hell. Why? Because there is an end to going to hell. One eventually is released and comes back to this human form of life. But if one attains Sayuja Mukti, then that's eternal, that's permanent, and one never again retains his individuality or consciousness. So this Sayuja Mukti, this becoming one with God, is actually a kind of hellish punishment. And in fact, when Krishna was present on this planet 5,000 years ago, he awarded Sayuja Mukti to many people. And who were they? They were all demons who had come to attack Krishna or his friends or family. And when Krishna killed them, he allowed them to merge into his existence, which means that they would never exist as individuals again. So, if this is the treatment that God gives to his enemies, why should we desire it? Are we God's enemies? If we're trying to approach God through yoga, or trying to develop the wisdom through the esoteric teaching, or through the Vedas, then we should not be God's enemy, we should be his friend. Actually, we should begin by becoming God's servant. And this is called devotional service. Devotional service means that we don't desire to become one with God. In fact, we don't desire anything except to be his servant. But this is actually in itself a kind of liberation. What do I mean? Well, consider the servant of a king. The servant of a king gets to live in the palace with the king, gets to dress in the king's raiments and vestments that he bestows upon his servants. He has the finest food, which is cooked in the king's kitchen. He has wonderful accommodations, better than the average person. So why should we be working